No one saw this coming. Karoline Leavitt has just won an $800 million lawsuit against a sitting federal judge, and her first reaction on camera left the entire nation speechless. What began as a humiliating attack on her faith ended in a historic courtroom victory that's shaking the justice system to its core. But what Karoline reveals next about the judge, the system, and her plans for the future is even more explosive. This changes everything. It was supposed to be a routine hearing. Cameras were forbidden, reporters were silent, and the marble walls of the federal courtroom stood cold and unmoved. But as Karoline Leavitt stepped through those tall wooden doors, every eye turned. Not because she was famous, not because she was young, but because of the small silver cross hanging delicately around her neck. She had worn it every day since she was 14. It wasn't loud. It wasn't ostentatious. But that morning, it became the target of an assault so brazen, so calculated, that even seasoned court observers were left stunned. The judge, appointed during a previous administration and known for his rigid secularism, glared at her from the bench before uttering a single word. "Miss Leavitt," he said, "you'll need to remove that necklace. This is a court of law, not a church service." The air turned electric. Karoline blinked once. She didn't flinch, didn't speak, just looked him dead in the eye. There was a silence that stretched for what felt like hours. The kind of silence that happens before a storm. Then, calmly but firmly, she replied, "Then you'll have to remove my soul as well." Gasps echoed through the gallery. One bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Even a clerk stopped typing. The judge's eyes narrowed. His gavel slammed down with a thud that rang through the chamber. $5,000, he snapped. Contempt of court. And consider this your only warning. Any further display of religious iconography will result in your removal from these proceedings. The contempt charge wasn't just punitive, it was symbolic. A warning shot, and Karoline knew exactly what it meant. But she didn't move, didn't touch the cross. And that moment, frozen in the minds of all who were present, was when the true battle began. Outside the courtroom, the media began to stir. A few blurry cell phone photos leaked. Headlines trickled in. Leavitt fined for refusing to remove cross. Faith versus federal bench. Sparks fly in D.C. courtroom. But what the headlines missed was the deeper war playing out beneath the surface. This wasn't just about jewelry. It was about power. About who gets to define the boundaries of faith in public life. About whether an unelected judge could silence not only a woman, but a worldview. Karoline walked out of that hearing not broken, but burning with purpose. She didn't cry. She didn't rant. But that night, she made a call. A quiet one. To her legal team. And then to a group of constitutional lawyers who had long warned about the creeping overreach of the judiciary. The decision was made before the next sunrise. She would sue him, personally, for $800 million. And if the system wanted a war, she'd give it one. Most people would have walked away, taken the fine, let the humiliation fade into the next news cycle. But not her. That cross wasn't just metal. It was a line in the sand. And when it was crossed, she didn't flinch. She fired back. Just days after the incident, whispers began circulating in legal circles. At first, they sounded impossible. No one sues a sitting federal judge. Not seriously. Not for hundreds of millions. But then the paperwork landed. Official. Sharp. Ruthless. A lawsuit, $800 million, filed not just against the court system, but directly naming the man who had tried to silence her. The core of the case was bold. Religious discrimination, targeted suppression, and abuse of judicial power. But it didn't stop there. The complaint unveiled a pattern. Communications between court officials and outside advocacy groups. Timestamps that aligned suspiciously with canceled speaking engagements, and metadata suggesting internal memos had been shared with political operatives. This wasn't just about a cross anymore. It was about systemic sabotage. Within 48 hours, legal commentators were in meltdown. Some called it suicidal. Others called it the boldest constitutional challenge of the decade. The news anchors didn't know what to do with it. One minute, they laughed it off. The next, they were booking constitutional scholars just to understand what the implications could be if she won. The defense came hard and fast. Filings dismissed the case as a publicity stunt. Spokespeople called her unstable, extremist, unfit for public discourse. But she stayed silent. No counter-interviews, no press conferences, just the slow, methodical gathering of evidence. And behind the scenes, the real war began. Her legal team wasn't composed of flashy cable news lawyers. It was a unit, tight, brilliant, and motivated not by money, but by principle. They pulled court records, leaked transcripts, and internal communications that revealed something chilling, a deliberate effort to monitor her online presence, flag her interviews, and pressure sponsors into silence. A judicial hit job, dressed in robes. One document, later referred to in court as Exhibit C, became the centerpiece. A string of emails between court aides and a well-known media consultant, discussing containment strategy and how to minimize the optics of martyrdom. The language wasn't just cold, it was surgical, calculated, and it left the courtroom stunned. Every day brought a new revelation. What began as a single act of defiance snowballed into a constitutional reckoning. And for the first time in years, Americans, ordinary ones, silent ones, started asking real questions. How far had the bench drifted from the Constitution? And what happens when someone finally fights back? The headlines changed. No longer dismissive. No longer mocking. Just 4 words, bold and clear across the front page of the Washington Standard. She's going all in. Day 17. The courtroom was packed, not with journalists. Those came later, but with eyes that watched from across the country. Every seat was filled. The air buzzed with anticipation. Cameras weren't allowed, but the world was already watching. Because something had shifted. The silence was over. It began with a flash drive. Plain, unmarked, handed to the clerk with no ceremony. The defense objected, predictably, but the presiding judge overruled it. The irony lost on no one, and allowed the contents to be displayed on the courtroom's central screen. What followed didn't feel like legal proceedings. It felt like detonation. The screen lit up with internal emails, calendar entries, and encrypted messages, all pointing to a coordinated effort behind closed doors to marginalize, isolate, and ultimately destroy the reputation of one individual. The most damning part? A quote from a private email sent from a senior court advisor to an unnamed external donor. "We need a breaker. That cross is a symbol, and symbols can be dangerous." The courtroom gasped. Even reporters, trained to remain detached, looked around in disbelief. The judge, the very one being sued, sat still, a mask of control over a face that had grown noticeably pale. For the first time, power looked nervous. The legal team didn't flinch. Piece by piece, they laid out the timeline. Court decisions that coincided with sudden sponsor withdrawals. Social media accounts flagged and deboosted just hours after private court meetings. And then came the final nail, footage. Leaked video from a closed-door seminar at an elite legal forum. In it, the same judge appeared to joke. "We've got ways to keep certain voices out of public view. You can call it judicial discretion. I call it public hygiene." The clip hit live news before the court even adjourned. Within minutes, networks broke their scheduled programming. Social media exploded. Hashtags trended. The term judicial hygiene became a punchline and a warning. She remained seated the entire time, hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. No gloating, no outbursts, just steady calm, the kind of presence that unnerves people who rely on fear to maintain control. Outside, crowds began to form. Supporters held candles. Critics held signs. But inside, the air was thick with something else, realization. The case had outgrown its original scope. It was no longer about an individual. It was about an institution. And the institution was cracking. By the end of the day, major law schools had released statements. Civil liberties groups, once hesitant to weigh in, issued urgent press releases. And one senator tweeted, "If this is what's happening behind courtroom doors, then no American is safe." The next morning, security was doubled. The courtroom was sealed. And the judge, still robed, still silent, refused to recuse himself. The war had gone public, and there was no turning back now. The outside world saw the headlines, the viral clips, the soaring support, but none of them saw the cost. Every war has casualties. This one began quietly. The first sign came in the form of a late-night phone call. A family member had been followed home. No confrontation, just a parked car idling too long. Then a message slid under a windshield. Back down. It's bigger than you think. No signature, no logo, just a warning. Then came the digital siege. Personal emails, some more than a decade old, were leaked to the press. Innocuous conversations twisted into scandalous sound bites. News anchors ran with it. The phrase credibility crisis became a media favorite. And yet, none of it touched the heart of the lawsuit. It was distraction, smoke, designed to intimidate. One member of the legal team received a letter from the Bar Association. An anonymous complaint had been filed, questioning their ethical fitness. Another had their children's school contacted by unknown parties, raising safety concerns. No one said the words, but the message was clear. Get out while you still can. But no one left. Then came the jury incident. One morning, without warning, juror number 6 was dismissed for health reasons. But sources inside the courthouse whispered a different story, that she had received a visit from someone claiming to represent a federal agency. No official record, no paper trail, just fear. That's when the tone changed. The team stopped assuming things would be fair. Extra security was hired. Communications were encrypted. Meetings were moved offline, in person, in silence. Every day in court became a psychological test. How much pressure could one case absorb before it shattered? And yet, she showed up. Every morning. Calm. Prepared. Unshaken. In interviews, she said little. Behind the scenes, she said even less. But her presence, unmoving, unyielding, became its own kind of resistance. Supporters began to call it the quiet stand. Meanwhile, opponents tried everything. A media leak suggested the lawsuit was funded by foreign interests. Within hours, it was debunked. Another story accused her of weaponizing religion for political gain, a narrative that fell flat when pastors, rabbis, and even imams spoke out in support of her right to wear a symbol of faith. What no one could spin was the footage, the judge's voice, the pattern of suppression, and the undeniable reality that this was no longer a courtroom drama. It was a cultural reckoning. But as the days wore on, the fatigue set in. Sleep came in fragments. The pressure never lifted. Every hallway in the courthouse felt longer. Every gavel strike louder. And yet, behind the scenes, something remarkable was happening. A nation was paying attention. Letters poured in, handwritten, tear-stained, raw. Veterans, single mothers, small-town pastors, teenagers, all saying the same thing: don't stop. If you stand, we stand. The cost was real, but so was the movement. And in that quiet, exhausted resolve, a truth became clear. Some battles are worth everything. Even this one. The courtroom was silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that lives between heartbeats. A stillness so absolute that even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to vanish. 12 jurors had disappeared into deliberation for 36 hours. No leaks, no signals, just waiting. And then the doors opened. No eye contact, no emotion, just papers in hand and steps so rehearsed they bordered on robotic. The foreperson handed the verdict to the bailiff. The judge, not the defendant, but a neutral substitute appointed due to unusual circumstances, reviewed it silently. And read aloud. On the charge of targeted violation of constitutional rights, liable. On the charge of religious discrimination, liable. On the charge of reputational harm, defamation, and abuse of authority, liable. Every word landed like a strike of thunder. And then came the number. $800 million. The sound that followed wasn't cheering. It wasn't chaos. It was a collective exhale, a moment of disbelief so sharp that it bent reality for just a second. People looked at each other to confirm they'd heard correctly. Some wept. Some laughed. Some simply stared forward, unblinking. She didn't move. No fist pump. No tears. Just a slow, deliberate nod, as if she had seen this outcome long before anyone else believed it was possible. But the decision did more than shift the balance of one legal case. It cracked open the conversation across the country. Suddenly, every hidden story had oxygen. Former government employees spoke up. Whistleblowers emerged. Faith-based professionals from law, education, and even medicine began sharing their own experiences of being quietly marginalized for what they wore, what they said, or what they believed. This wasn't just vindication. It was ignition. Even opponents, previously dismissive, were forced to acknowledge the gravity of what had occurred. A federal judge had been held personally accountable in a court of law for violating the basic liberties enshrined in the Constitution. No bureaucracy to hide behind. No technicalities to escape through. The precedent was now real. Outside, cameras roll nonstop. Protesters and supporters mixed on the courthouse steps, their chants clashing in rhythm, but united by a shared sense. The system had been rocked. Editorial boards scrambled to keep up. Politicians released statements. Most were cautious. Some were panicked. But the most powerful response came from a little girl. Her letter, later read aloud during a live interview, said, "They told me I couldn't wear my cross necklace at school, but now I wear it every day because I saw someone who didn't back down." That letter went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple, honest, proof that something deeper had shifted in the American mind. And the woman at the center of it all still didn't gloat. Her only words that day, whispered into a single microphone before walking away. "This wasn't for me. It was for everyone who thought they were alone." The verdict had barely settled when the flood began. It started with a single clip. One question, one answer. A reporter outside the courthouse asked, "What does it feel like to win $800 million?" She paused, looked out over the crowd, not with triumph, but with something quieter, more personal. It was never about the money. Those 7 words traveled faster than any press release. Within an hour, they were quoted on cable news, reposted by pastors and politicians alike, and turned into a digital banner across the websites of every major media outlet in the country. But it wasn't the words alone that sparked something. It was the way they were spoken. No celebration, no fury, just conviction. By that evening, the clip had hit 20 million views. Then came the letters. More than before. Thousands pouring in from small towns, retirement homes, military bases, and high schools. Some were printed on notebook paper. Others came in emails with subject lines like, "Thank you for standing when I couldn't." A fire had been lit, not one of rebellion, but of quiet remembrance, of forgotten principles, of a belief that faith, freedom, and dignity were not relics, but rights. International media caught on next. In France, a panel debated the rise of religious discrimination in democratic systems. In Brazil, a commentator called the ruling a cultural earthquake. In Poland, state television simply ran a banner. She didn't bow. Even critics couldn't deny the impact. Some tried to twist the narrative, accusing her of stoking division or politicizing belief, but their words fell hollow. The footage spoke for itself. The documents were real. The judge's own voice had become the prosecution's strongest evidence. In one especially revealing segment, a longtime television host, previously skeptical, admitted on air, whether you agree with her or not, she exposed something that needed exposing. That takes guts. Behind closed doors, powerful people were less poetic. Legal insiders reported a wave of panic sweeping through federal offices. Meetings were called. Memos were rewritten. Quiet inquiries began about the legal exposure of other officials who had acted outside constitutional lines. Some retired early. Others lawyered up. But while the establishment scrambled, she stayed quiet. No tour. No book deal. No self-congratulations. Instead, her first move was unexpected. A visit to a small, rural church where her grandfather once preached. No cameras. No speech. Just a moment of reflection and a short prayer with a group of children, most too young to understand what had just happened in that Washington courtroom. Later, someone asked her what she prayed for. The answer was simple. That courage outlives controversy. That quote became a rallying cry online. It appeared on T-shirts, bumper stickers, and even church marquees. But the energy wasn't centered on her as a person. It was what she had provoked, a wave of awareness that could no longer be ignored. And just as the world began to absorb the shock, a new twist emerged, one that threatened to undo everything. Victory has a strange silence to it. After the headlines fade, after the speeches stop, there's a quiet that settles. But this silence didn't last. It broke just 72 hours after the verdict. A filing, buried at the bottom of the court's digital docket, surfaced with little fanfare. An appeal. The judge, now disgraced, had launched a full legal counteroffensive. Not personally, not publicly, but through a complex web of legal proxies and organizations most Americans had never heard of. But some had. One investigative journalist traced the funding of the appeal to a network of nonprofits with overseas donors. On paper, they were advocacy groups. In practice, they functioned as legal insulation, designed to drag out cases, tie up funds, and bury precedents in endless litigation. This wasn't about clearing a name. It was about erasing a moment, erasing what had just happened. The legal strategy was aggressive. It claimed procedural flaws, media contamination, judicial bias. It even accused the jury of being psychologically influenced by viral content, a bold assertion considering that the most damning evidence had come straight from the judge's own communications. And yet, the appeal was allowed. Suddenly, everything was back on the table. The financial award was frozen pending review. The legal team, already battle-worn, was forced to mobilize again. And while public support remained high, the machinery of the system had shifted into gear, cold, slow, and ruthless. But what they didn't count on was what had changed outside the courtroom. Momentum. Across the country, citizens began demanding transparency in their own jurisdictions. Faith groups, civil rights organizations, even skeptics, those who didn't agree with her theology but supported her right to express it, began organizing. Town halls filled. Petitions surged. State-level reforms were drafted in days. Something had awakened. And then came the announcement. Standing behind a simple wooden podium, she addressed a room packed wall to wall with cameras. No teleprompter, no entourage, just a single sheet of paper in her hands. "I never asked for a movement," she said. "But now that it's here, we're going to protect it." She outlined plans to launch a national legal initiative dedicated to defending the rights of students, workers, and public servants who faced religious discrimination. Not political, not partisan, just constitutional. Then came the final line. "And if this appeal is an attempt to wear us down, to exhaust our faith, let it be known, we're just getting started." The room erupted. But beyond the applause, in a darkened conference room across the city, meetings were already underway. Emails marked urgent. Phone calls without records. The same forces that had tried to silence her the first time weren't finished. They were regrouping. Because if one voice could spark a national fire, what happens when millions begin to speak? This wasn't closure. This was ignition. And the real fight? It had only just begun.